In this video, I want to give an introduction to multi-level modeling, which is an analysis technique that goes a bit beyond the general linear model and to include random effects, which I'll introduce in a bit. So the multi-level model is a statistical technique that allows for analysis of data with hierarchical structure, where we have observations nested in something else, maybe multiple observations per person, or maybe people nested in classrooms, etc. In JAS, this is called linear mixed models. Now, a hierarchical structure you can get in many cases. But as I said, maybe students in classes, patients in hospitals, or measures per subject. And we saw already repeated measures ANOVA that we have for that setting. The multi-level model allows for a very similar analysis to repeated measures ANOVA, and many people prefer it over repeated measures ANOVA. The multi-level model handles the violation of assumption of independence. So if your independence assumption is violated, then you quite often land at a multi-level framework. What it does, it allows for the estimation of fixed effects, which is the average effect, and random effects, the variability around this average. Basically, any parameter in a linear model has a fixed effect, an average that holds for all the clusters or all the people, and a random effect that might be different per person or per cluster, whatever you're modeling. It's a technique that goes beyond the scope of this course, PL2132. For more details, there's actually a graduate level course that we offer on this, PL5222. So the type of data that we see in multi-level modeling is like this. We have, for example, children nested in classrooms. Or maybe even worse, we model some schools or sample some schools, then we sample some class in those schools, and then we measure all the children in those schools. We have to take into account that children per classroom differ. They have a different teacher, for example, which will have a big impact on the children themselves. And we might also want to model some relationships here at a different level. So maybe we want to include a predictor which is related to the teacher. How good is the teacher? How much experience is the teacher? Right? So let's say we're modeling anxiety in children, test anxiety, for example. Right? So we have multiple measures per class, but we actually want to model also as predictor, experienced teacher, or maybe even as a level 3 predictor, as to call it, some school level predictor, like location of school, etc. Or we might have multiple measures per person. So now the child is here in level 1, so level 1 is the bottom level. Level 2 is the level above that, level 3 is the level above that. Now the child moved to level 2, we have multiple measures per person. Right. So then we land in the repeated measures framework. You see here that it naturally occurs in multi-level modeling. So what does it look like? Suppose we measure some x, some predictor, and some y, some outcome variables, in a subject that's in group G. So we have subject I, some random subject, maybe 1, 2, or 3, and that's in group G. In this case, we have 4 groups. We have the hamsters, 3 groups, 4. We have hamsters here, we have cats, hamsters, hedgehogs, dogs, and bunnies, 5 groups even, right? And each subject is part of each of these groups. In a multi-level framework, we would phrase this in this way. We have a level 1 model. We have the outcome variable equals some intercept plus a slope times x plus a residual. Nothing new there. But the thing that is new is that there's a subscript g that's added to these equations. So I have here subject g, right, that's added to the equation, which means that the intercept here depends on the group membership, and the slope does so too. And that's what we're modeling in level 2. In level 2, we model that these intercepts and these slopes themselves have some mean from intercept here and some variation around the mean. And that's the whole idea about multi-level modeling. We have a random intercept, as we call it. It's random because it differs per group. It's a random slope, it differs per group. And then we have fixed effects. Fixed effects are the averages, and the random effects are the deviations around these averages. So every parameter has a fixed effect and a random effect. If you choose to model them with random effects, you don't have to. You might choose to only include a random intercept, for example. Then you want to take into account that each of these groups starts at a different point, but the trajectory is otherwise the same. Or you might want to add a random slope here. That means that each group has a different trajectory as well. So the nice thing about multi-level modeling is that it doesn't actually estimate these different effects per person. It estimates the distribution, and that makes it very, very stable. Basically, you just get the mean and a standard deviation, and you can get the person-wise effect if you want, or the cluster level effect if you want, but you don't have to. So the idea is like this: every animal here, in this case, every group, has a different effect. And this could also be person if you have repeated measures per person. Every person might have slightly different effect. So remember the mixed design we discussed in week 2. We had animals, right? We had different subjects in this case. We didn't have an animal grouping factor. We had a control and experimental condition. So we had some animals in a control condition, some animals in an experimental condition. And we measured them before and after intervention. Right? And we wanted to see, okay, do they increase? Do they become more happy after their intervention? In this case, we would be interested in the interaction effect. So we'll see, okay, is there a significant interaction here? Do the animals in the experimental condition increase and the animals in the control condition maybe not? So we can do it with a mixed ANOVA with conditions between subject factor and measurement as a within subject factor, as you did in the last video. But we could also fit a multi-level model with random effects for subjects. What we do then is we add a random intercept, which means a different mean level per subject in the multi-level model. We don't add a random slope per se. That's sometimes a bit tricky to do. So in this case, we just add a different mean level and we let the multi-level model handle it. In fact, the mixed ANOVA is actually a special case in the multi-level model. Like you can reproduce in certain settings, you can reproduce the exact same values. Now let's take a look at JASP. So here I am in JASP with the example we saw before, a different design than the one I just showed. Right, a design where we have 100 subjects. They are different types of animals, hamster, cats, dogs, so between subject factor, measured 3 times on their happiness after 3 different interventions. In this data, we can do repeated measures ANOVA. We get our effect, our condition by animal, and our animal between person effect in these tables over here. Now we can do the same thing with the multi-level model. We go in R, we have now, the data is now in long format, which is a bit different. Right, we have one variable in happiness and we have multiple rows for each subject. For each condition, 1 row. We go to mixed models, linear mixed models, and here we put happiness on the dependent variable. And now I add all 3, I'll do it separate as a fixed effect variable, except for subject. Subject I'll add as a random effects grouping variable. Alright, let's also add the model. And let's say we only want a random intercept. I don't include random slopes, it means that there's no different effect per. Yeah, it would be actually complicated in this setting. So with this random intercept, what's happening here is that a different mean is included for each subject. And the multi-level model takes into account that these are different subjects that are measured multiple times. Right? So in the model, there's now an intercept, which is different per person, which is basically similar to what we had before with our 99 dummy variables. In this case, it would model the between person effect. Now it's modeling it 1 mean, 1 variance, which is a bit more elegant to do. And we can do more complicated things. I won't talk about it here, but we can do more complicated things here as well. So let's see, in our linear mixed model effects, I have the main effects of animal. Now everything is nicely in one table. The main effects of animal with 2 on 97 degrees of freedom with an F value of 42.57. 42.57, 2 on 97, same effect as here. We have condition 2 on 194 with 5.669 F value, 5.669 F value, same effect here. We have our animal by condition interaction effect, F value of 619, same here, So we're reproducing actually the exact same results here in the linear mixed model. Now, that's not always the case. That's only the case if you have balanced groups, which in this case I have. Otherwise, linear mixed models might give you some different results, but it's not necessarily worse to do. Now let's take a look at the pen is mightier than a keyboard example that I showed in the beginning of the course. In this case, they had in study 1 of this study, they had students come in. There was either a keyboard, or a laptop I mean, or a pen and paper. They had to take notes during a video, and then later they test their recall, factual and conceptual questions. Alright, so there are two independent variables, actually, note taking and video topic. So there were different videos. There were 1 of 5 videos, and they got 1 of 5 videos at random, which were different videos. And there were 2 outcome variables, conceptual and factual recall. Now, actually, they could have treated that as a within-person factor in a repeated measure ANOVA. They just have recall as outcome variable because they did both conceptual and factual. Might have been more elegant to do, but they treated it as 2 separate ANOVAs. So what they did actually is to do 2 multi-level linear mixed models in this case. They treated videos as random effects. So they had 1 independent variable they were interested in, the effect of note taking, laptop versus longhand. They had 5 videos. They were not really interested in seeing how note taking relates to those video topics or how it differs, or is there an interaction effect between the topic of the video. Their videos were actually just 5 exemplary videos. They're just samples from a larger population of topics they could have chosen. And that's exactly why they chose to use a random effects model here. There are many videos, but it is not in the effect of one particular video or the interaction between videos and note taking. By using a random effects model, there are fewer parameters and have more generalizable results to other videos. Mainly, by treating the videos as random, they model a distribution of video topics, and the results potentially generalize to other possible topics that you could have included as well. If treated as fixed effects, it's harder to say. Right? Just by saying, okay, let's say if you have 5 types of animals, if we model them as random, which you could do as well, we could see, okay, over all possible animals, there's a distribution. If we have a categorical predictor or independent variable, like a group membership or your subject idea, if you have multiple observations, we can choose to treat that as a fixed factor or a random factor. This is a bit confusing terminology because I talked also about fixed effects and random effects. If we treat a categorical predictor as a fixed factor, it means we do what we've been doing so far. We use dummy encoding to represent the variable. We get associated coefficients for each dummy variable. We get a coefficient, right? We can also include them in interactions, etc. If we instead treat them as random factors, we don't do that. We don't do dummy encoding. We instead model a distribution over the parameters and model that a parameter, like an intercept or a slope, has a distribution over all the levels of the random factor. That's a little bit of a different terminology. Basically, if we treat a predictor as a random factor, then we would use multi-level modeling, and then we would see a fixed effect and a random effect. It's a bit confusing, but it's good to see these terms at least once. So a fixed factor is a factor where you have levels that are the only ones you really care about. Like for example, in gender, with male, female, or treatment condition, control versus an experimental condition, or versus maybe 2 experimental conditions, or measurement occasions. Maybe you have like, let's say type 1.0, type 1.1, type 1.2, maybe baseline, follow-up, right? Those kinds of designs. And you really care about those specific levels. You don't want to generalize to other potential levels. You don't want to generalize to other potential treatment conditions that you don't actually have or that don't exist. A random factor is one of those levels that you assume are a sample from a larger population that you want to generalize to. But there is the key difference, right? So we would use random factors for things like rooms. We have, let's say, 20 classrooms, and we don't actually care that much about these specific classrooms. We think those classrooms are samples from a larger population, right? Then we would treat it as a random factor and would model distribution over it. or stimuli with the videos that I showed. They don't care about these 5 particular topics, these 5 particular videos. They just know that they will have an effect. There will be heterogeneity. One video, the questions will be easier to recall than other videos. You need control for that. But those are just samples from other potential videos they could have taken. And this is the most important one, subjects. If you have subjects, you assume the subjects are a sample from a larger population that you want to sample from. And herein really lies the key difference. And this is also a reason why many people actually prefer to use multi-level modeling for a repeated measures design rather than repeated measures ANOVA. Because in repeated measures ANOVA, we would treat the subject ID as fixed. You would get a dummy variable, one fewer for each subject. And in the multi-level model, we would treat it as random. That's really the key difference between these two. So when would you model a factor as random? First, you assume that there is actually variability between levels. If you have repeated measures, you assume that people do have different averages over the occasions. If you have classrooms, you assume that there is an effect for the classroom. There is like some students in one classroom might generally be better than students in another classroom or have other different averages. You would treat a factor as random if you have many levels. That's like 100 subjects. Then the multi-level model under the hood only has 2 parameters rather than 99, which is much better, gives you much more stable results. And also, you don't really want all these like coefficients for all these different dummy variables within all these different levels. And most importantly, you have to generalize beyond specific levels in your sample. So if you include random factors, then you are doing multi-level modeling. It's no longer GLM. You can't use multiple regression. It is another framework, and we call it multi-level modeling. And it's actually a bit more technical. The repeated measures ANOVA is actually very similar to multi-level modeling with subjects as a random factor. But you'll see in JAS that the F values can be the same or will be very similar, especially when the data is balanced, which means that you have to take a similar number of people in groups. So we can draw similar conclusions from it, but we can actually do much more with multi-level modeling. Now, I wanted to give you a brief introduction to multi-level modeling, explain you a bit the idea what is happening, that we're modeling a distribution over a parameter, that there's heterogeneity that we take into account. And I want you to understand that there's something called a fixed factor or random factors, or fixed factors or random factors, that we can choose to model something as a fixed factor or a random factor, and that it matters. This is important to know, because later, if you do your own research, not necessarily for this course, but maybe in the lab modules, or maybe as an honors thesis, or beyond, you might encounter designs where you think, okay, I actually need to treat this stimuli or a repeated measure subject as a random factor. It's good to know, have an idea of what it then refers to. Now, I don't actually expect you to be able to do multi-level modeling. I showed in JASP how to do it, but you don't really need to be able to do that yourself. It is a pretty advanced and complicated topic. It will require much more explanation than I can actually fit into this course. But really just see this video as an introduction. You don't have to understand the technical details or how to do it in JASP, but it's good to understand like the logic and the ideas behind multi-level modeling. That's it for this video.